Blood doesn't wash out of soil easily. When an alien armada glasses a frontier colony, they expect a quick surrender and total silence. They didn't account for a solitary man living offered on a ridge overlooking the burn zone. They didn't know his cabin sat right on top of a decommissioned doomsday dreadnought. Welcome to a story about crossing the wrong species, where survival isn't the goal, annihilation is. Brace yourselves. A human warship is incoming, and it's bringing hell. Frost clung to the pine needles, thick and sharp. Up on the ridge, the air was thin enough to make a man's lungs work for every breath. Henry Boon didn't mind the effort. He liked the quiet. He liked the way the cold bit into his cheeks, reminding him he was still breathing, still upright. He swung the splitting maul. The heavy iron head bit through the oak round with a sharp crack, sending to perfect halves tumbling into the snow. Henry rested the maul against his boot. He wiped a gloved hand across his brow, exhaling a plume of white steam. Below him, the valley stretched out in a patchwork of green and gold. The colony of New Roanoke. It was a modest settlement, 3,000 souls, mostly farmers, miners, and folks looking to escape the crowded, polluted core worlds. They had a schoolhouse with a tin roof that caught the morning light. They had a market where Old Man Miller sold crooked carrots and strong cider. Henry went down there twice a year to trade furs for coffee and ammunition. He didn't know their names. They didn't ask his. It was an arrangement built on the kind of mutual respect only the frontier could foster. He turned back to the wood pile. Then the sky tore open. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure, a sudden violent shift in the atmosphere that popped Henry's ears and dropped him to his knees. The wood pile scattered as the ground bucked. Henry looked up. The clouds were burning. High in the stratosphere, dull gray shapes broke through the atmospheric drag. They were massive, angular, ugly things, sleek where they needed to be, jagged everywhere else. Drev cruisers. The alien collective had been pushing into human space for 3 years, claiming territory, erasing colonies. The local news feeds down in the valley had talked about treaties, about peace talks. Henry spat into the snow. Peace was a word politicians used to keep the sheep calm before the slaughter. A hum vibrated through the bedrock, traveling up through the solace of Henry's boots. A beam of blinding incandescent blue light snapped down from the lead cruiser. It struck the center of New Roanoke. Henry didn't close his eyes. He forced himself to watch. There was no explosion. Not at first. The blue light simply erased the town square. The tin roof of the schoolhouse vaporized. The market turned to vapor. The air in the valley superheated, expanding outward in a concentric shockwave of displaced atmosphere and burning oxygen. Then came the sound, a low, guttural roar that vibrated the fillings in Henry's teeth. The shockwave hit the ridge. It snapped pine trees in half like toothpicks. Henry flattened himself against the frozen earth, burying his face in the crook of his arm as a wave of heat washed over him. The snow around him flashed into steam. The scent of pine was replaced instantly by the acrid chemical stench of ozone and burning carbon. The bombardment lasted for exactly 4 minutes. When the earth stopped shaking, Henry slowly pushed himself up. The left side of his face was raw, blistered from the radiant heat. He didn't feel it. He walked to the edge of the ridge. New Roanoke was gone. The green and gold patchwork was replaced by a smooth, glowing crater of molten glass. The river that had wound through the valley was flashing into steam, hissing as it poured over the superheated earth. Nothing moved. Nothing screamed. 3,000 people gone between one breath and the next. Flakes of white began to drift down from the bruised sky. Henry held out his hand. A flake landed on his leather glove. It wasn't snow. It was ash. Human ash. Wood ash. The pulverized remains of a quiet life. He looked up at the sky. The Drev ships hung in the low orbit, dark and silent, satisfied with their work. They were running sweeps, likely scanning for biological signatures. They wouldn't find any in the valley. The heat had been too absolute. Henry turned around. His cabin was still standing, sheltered by the rock face of the peak. His hound, a battered old underscore hound named Barnaby, was hiding under the porch, shivering. "Stay put, old man," Henry rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. He didn't run to his cabin to pack a bag. He didn't grab his hunting rifle. A rifle wasn't going to fix a glass valley. A rifle wasn't going to pull 3,000 ghosts out of the dirt. He walked past the cabin, boots crunching heavily in the mix of snow and falling ash. He headed for the old rusted barn out back, the one he never let anyone near when the traders occasionally ventured up his trail. Henry grabbed the heavy chain wrapped around the barn doors, yanked the padlock off, and hauled the doors open. Inside, sitting on a cracked concrete floor, was an old rusted agricultural tractor. Henry climbed into the seat, turned the key, and threw it into gear. The diesel engine sputtered, choked on the ashy air, and finally roared to life. He drove the tractor out into the cold, leaving a massive empty space in the center of the barn. He walked to the center of that empty space. He knelt down, brushing away decades of dirt, straw, and grease. Beneath the grime, a heavy iron ring was set flush into the floor. Henry grabbed the ring. His knuckles turned white. With a grunt that tore at his throat, he pulled. The heavy steel plate groaned, grating against rust and time before flipping back to reveal a dark square shaft. Cold, stale air breathed up from the dark. Henry stared down into the abyss. He had spent 20 years trying to forget what was down there. He had traded his uniform for flannel, his command for solitude. He had convinced himself that the galaxy's wars were no longer his concern. He looked back toward the open barn doors. The ash was falling thicker now, coating the rusted hood of the tractor, blanketing the pines in gray. The Drev had brought the war to his front porch. They had turned his neighbors into dirt. Henry stepped onto the rusted rungs of the ladder bolted to the side of the shaft and began to climb down into the dark. The descent took 20 minutes. The air grew colder the deeper he went, smelling of machine oil, old copper, and the distinct sterile scent of preserved steel. Henry didn't need a flashlight. His hands knew every rung. His boots found every foothold. He hit the bottom with a dull thud. A narrow catwalk extended over a massive unlit cavern. Henry walked forward, his steps echoing in the absolute silence. He reached the end of the catwalk and found the breaker box. He punched a heavy fist against the side of the metal casing to knock the dust loose, then through the primary switch. Fluorescent lights flickered to life. One by one, they buzzed and sparked, illuminating the cavern. It wasn't a cave. It was a dry dock carved directly into the heart of the mountain. Resting in the cradle of the dock was a monster. It had no sleek lines. It had no aerodynamic grace. It was built during the first expansion wars, designed by engineers who viewed space combat as a brutal math equation. It was a solid block of depleted uranium armor, tungsten shielding, and thruster banks the size of skyscrapers. It looked like a heavy iron fist forged for the sole purpose of breaking teeth. The hold was painted a dull matte black, devoid of markings except for the faded white letters near the bow. USS Gravedigger. Henry walked across the gantry leading to the main airlock. He placed his bare hand on the biometric scanner beside the door. The scanner was dead. He waited. A second later, a backup capacitor clicked and a weak red laser swept over his palm, then up to his retina. Identity confirmed. A mechanical voice grated through a corroded speaker. Commander Boon, Henry status retired. Warning. Protocol 731 in effect. Unauthorized access. Override. Authorization code. Winner's end. Henry said, his voice flat. The heavy locking mechanisms inside the door clacked like bones breaking. With a hiss of escaping argon gas, the airlock slid open. Henry stepped inside. The corridor was narrow, built for utility, not comfort. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling. The floor grates rattled under his weight. He made his way to the bridge. It was a cramped circular room buried deep in the center of the ship, wrapped in 30 meters of solid armor. No windows, no observation decks, just screens, tactile switches, and the captain's chair. He sank into the leather seat. It was stiff, cracking at the edges. He ran his callous hands over the manual flight yokes. Main power, Henry commanded. Deep in the bowels of the mountain, for heavy water fusion reactors began to cycle. The ship shuddered. It wasn't the smooth, silent hum of modern civilian craft. It was the violent, angry vibration of caged physics. The lights on the bridge flared from emergency red to operational white. The central console booted up. Text scrolled rapidly across the main display. Systems online diagnostic commencing. The ship's mainframe reported. The AI didn't have a personality subroutine. Henry had stripped it out decades ago. He didn't want a machine pretending to be his friend. He just wanted it to do the math. Status of the main armament, Henry asked. Spinal mass driver online. Ammunition, 400 rounds. Dense core tungsten. Point defense. Kinetics, operational. Torpedo tubes, empty. Good enough. He didn't need torpedoes. He had a gun the length of a skyscraper and armor thick enough to survive a stellar flare. Atmospheric sensors. Give me a look at the sky, Henry said. Atmospheric sensors. Give me a look at the sky, Henry said. The screens flickered, pulling telemetry from the disguised sensor arrays hidden in the pine trees up on the ridge. The tactical map materialized. 7 Drev cruisers. They had descended lower into the atmosphere. Hovering in a loose formation over the glass remains of New Roanoke, they were deploying atmospheric scrubbers, likely trying to clear the ash and radiation so they could land ground troops to secure the minerals. They were arrogant. They thought the planet was dead. Henry flipped a row of toggle switches on his right console. Disengage docking clamps flood the launch silo. Warning. The computer chimed. Silo doors are unresponsive. Structural blockage detected. 500,000 tons of igneous rock present over launch tube. I know, Henry said. The military had buried the ship when the peace treaties were signed. They filled the silo with concrete and rock, erasing it from the maps. They thought the war was over. Henry strapped the heavy harness over his chest, pulling the belts tight until they bit into his collarbones. He grabbed the flight yokes. Divert all secondary power to the forward impulse engines. Overload the structural integrity field on the bow. Commander, firing impulse engines within an enclosed space will result in catastrophic blowback. Do it. Henry growled. He watched the engine temperature gauges spike into the red. The deck plates beneath his boots began to vibrate so violently his teeth rattled in his skull. The sound was deafening. A localized earthquake trapped inside a steel coffin. Main thrust. Maximum burn? Henry roared. He slammed the throttles forward to the Drev fleet commander hovering above the ruined valley. The human planet of Harvest 4 was a solved problem. The bombardment had been precise. The biologicals had been eradicated. It was a standard pacification maneuver. Now they just had to wait for the rock to cool. The commander stood on the polished, pristine bridge of his flagship, watching the ash clouds swirl on the tactical displays. His species was elegant. They built ships of glass and light, relying on advanced energy shielding and hyperfocused plasma emitters. They viewed warfare as a precise surgical art. Suddenly, the tactical display flared a blinding red. Seismic alarms wailed across the bridge. The commander narrowed his four eyes, stepping toward the primary monitor. The mountain ridge to the north was moving. It wasn't a landslide. The entire peak of the mountain was bulging outward. Fissures miles long cracked across the stone, glowing with an impossible internal heat. Anomalous energy reading. The sensor officer hissed, his mandibles clicking in panic. Massive thermal spike. It's coming from under the rock. Before the commander could issue an order, the mountain detonated. 500,000 tons of rock, dirt, concrete, and pine trees were launched into the stratosphere. The shockwave ripped through the atmosphere, tearing the clouds apart. From the center of the eruption, a pillar of blue-white atomic fire surged upward, and riding that pillar of fire was a nightmare of iron. The Gravedigger didn't launch so much as it clawed its way out of the earth. It rose through the dust and falling boulders, a brutal, jagged wedge of black metal. It was shedding debris, its bow glowing cherry red from the sheer friction of pushing through solid stone. It hung in the air for a fraction of a second, an ugly, gravity-defying monolith. Inside the bridge, Henry tasted copper. The J-force was crushing his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. Alarms were shrieking, warning of hull stress and thermal overload. He ignored them. He kept his eyes locked on the tactical screen. The 7 Drev cruisers were right in front of him. Target the lead cruiser. Henry wheezed, his hands white-knuckling the yokes. Calculate firing solution for the spinal driver. Target locked. The computer droned. The Drev flagship was already reacting. Elegant turrets swiveled, painting the Gravedigger with targeting lasers. 3 plasma beams lashed out, striking the human ship's bow. On a modern ship, Those beams would have collapsed the energy shields and melted the hull. The Gravedigger didn't have energy shields. It had 20 meters of solid ablative armor. The plasma splashed against the tungsten, boiling away the outer layer of paint and scoring the metal, but it didn't penetrate. The ship barely even shuddered. "Fire," Henry said. The ship lurched backward as the spinal mass driver discharged. There was no bright flash of energy. There was only the brutal physics of electromagnetism, hurling a 3-ton slug of dense core tungsten at 4% the speed of light. The slug crossed the distance between the two ships in less than a blink. The Drev commander never even saw it coming. The kinetic penetrator hit the flagship's energy shield. The shield didn't fail. It simply couldn't process the sheer physical mass and velocity of the object. The slug punched through the energy barrier, struck the pristine glass and composite hull of the cruiser, and transferred its kinetic energy. The Drev flagship didn't explode. It shattered. The kinetic impact shattered the ship's spine instantly. The rear half of the cruiser crumpled inward while the front half was ripped away. The atmosphere inside the ship ignited from the friction, turning the shattered hull into an expanding cloud of debris and vaporized metal. One shot, one ship, one. Henry didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He shifted the yokes, banking the massive Dreadnought hard to port. The inertial dampeners whined in protest, fighting to keep Henry from being reduced to a smear on the bulkhead. Load Tube 2. Target the flanking cruisers. Point defense kinetics on autofire, Henry ordered, his voice cold, stripped of all humanity. The remaining 6 Drev cruisers broke formation, scattering like panicked insects. They realized too late that they weren't fighting a civilized military. They weren't fighting an enemy that cared about treaties or surgical strikes. They had awakened a graveyard and the dead were hungry. Thousands of solid tungsten rounds began pouring from the Gravedigger's rotary point defense cannons, creating an impenetrable wall of flak in the sky. It wasn't elegant. It was a meat grinder. A second Drev cruiser tried to climb out of the atmosphere to reach orbit. Henry swung the nose of the Gravedigger up, tracking its trajectory. He didn't wait for a perfect lock. He felt the rhythm of the ship, the heavy mechanical heartbeat of the beast he was riding. He squeezed the trigger. The second tungsten slug ripped through the atmosphere, tearing a vacuum tunnel through the air. It struck the fleeing cruiser right in its main drive engines. The alien ship detonated, a silent bloom of green plasma painting the gray sky. Down in the valley, the ashes of New Roanoke continued to fall, but now they were joined by the burning, shattered wreckage of the alien fleet raining from above. Henry wiped a trickle of blood from his nose, his eyes dead and focused. He was a mountain man. He knew how to clear a pest problem. You didn't negotiate with wolves. You just shot them until there were none left. "Bring us around," Henry muttered, tracking the third ship. "Let's finish the chore." Smoke filled the cabin, thick and tasting of electrical fires and old dust. 4 alien cruisers remained in the sky above the glass remains of New Roanoke. They had stopped scattering. They were reforming their formation, adapting to the brutal, archaic reality of the threat before them. The Drev commanders were arrogant, but they were not stupid. They recognized that their shields could not stop mass moving at relativistic speeds. They shifted tactics. Instead of elegant sweeping passes, the 4 sleek vessels grouped tightly, angling their prows downward. Their hulls began to glow with a sickly building violet light. They were charging their main plasma lances, linking their targeting telemetry. They planned to combine their fire to melt the mountain out of the sky. Henry Boon didn't blink. His left hand gripped the throttle, his right clutching the heavy dual-pronged flight yoke. Sweat cut lines through the soot and blood on his face. The Gravedigger was not a nimble ship. It was a hammer, and a hammer only knew one way to solve a problem: reroute life support power to the forward starboard thrusters. Henry rasped, "Warning. Life support power diversion will result in rapid temperature drop and oxygen depletion on the bridge." Ruit. The lights on the bridge dimmed to a faint bloody red. A chill immediately bit into the air, the kind of deep biting cold Henry was used to up on the ridge. He didn't care about the cold. He needed to move. 4 concentrated beams of violet plasma snapped down from the heavens. They twisted together in the atmosphere, forming a single blinding pillar of superheated energy aimed directly at the center of the Gravedigger's hull. Henry slammed his fist into the manual thruster controls, firing the starboard engines with everything they had. The massive dreadnought groaned, the structural integrity field screaming as the ship violently shoved itself sideways. It was an ugly, lumbering dodge. It wasn't quite fast enough. The combined plasma beam clipped the port side of the ship. The impact was deafening. 30 meters of solid depleted uranium and tungsten ablate of armor flashed into liquid slag in a microsecond. The ship violently lurched, throwing Henry hard against his harness. The straps dug into his collarbones, threatening to snap them. Consoles on the port side of the bridge exploded in showers of sparks and shattered glass. Alarms that had been ringing simply died. Their wiring vaporized. The computer's emotionless voice cut through the ringing in his ears. Hull breach detected on decks for through 9. Port side armor compromised. Ablative layers depleted. Extreme thermal wash. Henry tasted iron. He spit a mouthful of blood onto the steel grating below his chair. Compensate for the mass loss. Keep her nose up, he growled. He didn't check the damage reports. There was no damage control team waiting below decks. There were no engineers to patch the holes. It was just him, a machine. And the math. The Drev cruisers had exhausted their primary capacitor charge. They needed time to cycle their weapons. Henry wasn't going to give them the chance. Set the spinal driver to continuous cycle. Override the cooling safeties, Henry ordered. Continuous fire will warp the magnetic rails. Accuracy will degrade by 40%. They're big targets. Just keep throwing rocks. The Gravedigger shuddered as the massive gun running the length of the ship fired. A 3-ton tungsten slug ripped upward. The recoil pushed the dreadnought lower into the atmosphere, fighting the lift of the engines. 3 seconds later, the autoloader slammed another round into the chamber, and the gun fired again. Then again, it was suppressive fire on a planetary scale. The first slug missed completely, tearing a hole through the cloud cover. The second slug clipped the energy shield of the leftmost cruiser, spinning the sleek ship like a toy hit by a rock. The third slug found its mark. It caught the spinning cruiser dead center. The kinetic energy transfer shattered the vessel's delicate internal structure. It didn't explode. It simply tore apart under the impossible stress, scattering gleaming shards of composite hull and crystal and engine components across the sky. 3 down. 4 left. The remaining Drev ships broke their tight formation, realizing they were sitting ducks. 2 of them pitched their noses up, igniting their main drives to punch out of the atmosphere, retreating to the safety of high orbit, where their maneuverability would give them the advantage. The 4th cruiser, however, Dove. Its commander was either brave or furious. The sleek ship angled downward, weaving through the falling debris of its sister ship and accelerated directly toward the Gravedigger. It opened fire with its secondary batteries, peppering the dreadnought with rapid bursts of plasma. The shots splashed against Henry's remaining armor like rain against a tin roof. It was melting the outer layers, turning the black hole a furious glowing orange, but it wasn't piercing the core. Henry watched the incoming ship on his tactical feed. The spinal driver was still cycling, its rails glowing dangerously hot. It wouldn't be ready in time. He didn't reach for the weapon controls. He reached for the throttle. Reroute all remaining structural integrity power to the bow. Brace for kinetic impact, Henry said softly. He shoved the twin throttles entirely forward. The heavy water reactors screamed. The Gravedigger stopped trying to hold its altitude and surged upward, meeting the diving Drev cruiser head-on. The alien commander realized his mistake too late. He tried to bank away, his thrusters burning white-hot, but he had committed too much speed to the dive. The 2 ships collided. There was no sound on the bridge. The sheer violence of the impact overloaded the audio dampeners, leaving Henry in deafening silence. The Gravedigger's blunt, heavily armored nose smashed into the Drev cruiser. The alien energy shields flared and instantly collapsed. Glass, light, and composite materials shattered against millions of tons of unyielding human steel. The dreadnought simply plowed through the cruiser, breaking its back and splitting it into 2 burning halves that tumbled down toward the dead valley below. Henry hung in his harness, gasping for breath. The lights flickered and died, leaving only the tactical screens illuminating the smoke-filled room. 4 down. 3 left, but 2 had escaped to orbit. Henry reached out with a trembling, blood-slicked hand and pulled the nose of the ship up. He aimed the Gravedigger toward the stars. Gravity released its grip as the Gravedigger breached the exosphere. The violent shaking of atmospheric friction smoothed out into the cold, dead float of the vacuum. Outside, the sky shifted from bruised purple to the absolute unforgiving black of deep space. Inside the bridge, the silence was absolute. Henry unlatched the heavy harness. He floated out of the command chair, his boots leaving the deck plates. The artificial gravity generators had been knocked offline during the collision. He grabbed a handhold on the console and pulled himself toward the emergency locker, bolted to the rear bulkhead. His ribs were a broken mess. Every breath felt like a serrated knife dragging through his lungs. He popped the locker open, grabbed a standard Dussafield trauma kit, and pulled himself back to the chair. He strapped his waist in to keep from floating away. He ripped open his flannel shirt. A jagged piece of shrapnel from a blown console had embedded itself in his side just below his ribs. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a pair of sterilized pliers from the kit, clamped them onto the metal, and pulled. A fresh wave of blood bubbled out into the zero-gravity environment, forming dark floating spheres. Henry didn't groan. He grabbed a tube of surgical adhesive, squeezed it into the wound, and sealed it with 4 heavy staples from a kinetic gun. Status. Henry breathed, his voice a ragged whisper in the dark. Primary reactors at 60% efficiency, the computer replied, its voice devoid of the exhaustion Henry felt. Port side armor integrity severely compromised. Magnetic rails on the spinal driver require 20 minutes to cool before safe firing. Life support is operating on secondary reserves, and the enemy, the tactical screen flickered. To drift cruisers detected in high orbit. They have established a stationary defensive posture. Henry stared at the blips on the screen. He had a moment to breathe, a moment to think. It was a dangerous thing in a place like this. He looked around the cramped, darkened bridge. The Gravedigger had never been a beautiful ship. It was built during the first expansion wars, a time when humanity realized they weren't alone and that their neighbors viewed them as an invasive species. The ship was a tomb. It had always been a tomb. He remembered the day they decommissioned her, a gray rainy afternoon on a naval yard above Mars. Politicians in tailored suits had stood on a podium talking about a new era of understanding. They talked about disarmament. They talked about moving past the brutal methods of the past. Henry had stood in the back wearing his dress uniform, listening to the speeches. Beside him had been Thomas, his executive officer. Thomas had lost his left arm and half his jaw at the Battle of the Orion Gates. They think signing a piece of paper changes the universe. Thomas had mumbled through his prosthetic jaw. They think the wolves care about ink. Thomas died 3 years later, an infection the core world doctors couldn't bother to cure. The politicians went on making treaties. They buried the Gravedigger under a mountain on Harvest 4, a secret contingency that everyone conveniently forgot about because it was too ugly to remember. Henry had retired, moved into the cabin, and spent 20 years watching the snow fall, waiting for the day the politicians were proven wrong. He wiped the floating beads of blood out of his line of sight. He looked down at the tactical display showing the surface of Harvest 4. New Roanoke was still a glowing red scar on the planet's surface. Old Man Miller, the cider peddler, the school teacher, whose name Henry had never bothered to learn. 3,000 people who had trusted the treaties. They were gone, ash in the snow. Henry didn't fight for them because he loved them. He fought for them because they had been left defenseless by cowards. He fought because he was the only monster left with teeth sharp enough to bite back. He strapped the heavy harness back over his chest. He pulled it so tight the broken ribs ground together, forcing a sharp exhale through his teeth. Diver life support completely, Henry ordered. Pump everything we have into the maneuvering thrusters. Give me manual control of the rotary point defense cannons. Commander, complete loss of life support will result in asphyxiation in approximately 14 minutes. I won't need 14 minutes, Henry said. Take us in. The Gravedigger's massive thrusters flared, pushing the crippled, blackened Dreadnought deeper into the void. The 2 remaining Drev cruisers had chosen their battleground carefully. They sat in high orbit, hovering amidst the scattered wreckage of Harvest 4's destroyed communication satellites. They had linked their energy shields, creating a massive overlapping barrier of golden light. They had learned their lesson. They weren't going to try to outmaneuver the human dreadnought. They were going to form an impenetrable wall and burn it down from a distance. Henry watched the tactical display as the distance closed. He had no torpedoes to crack those shields. His main gun was overheated. The rails warped from the rapid fire in the atmosphere. The Gravedigger was a bleeding half-blind beast dragging itself toward the hunters. Warning: enemy vessels are charging long-range plasma artillery. Hold course, Henry muttered. The dark expanse of space lit up. Two massive concentrated streams of plasma erupted from the Drev phalanx. They crossed the void in out silence, striking the Gravedigger squarely on its reinforced bow. The ship bucked violently. The artificial gravity flickered on and off, sending loose tools, debris, and Henry's own floating blood crashing against the bulkheads. The temperature on the bridge spiked instantly. The ablat of armor was already gone. Now, the plasma was chewing directly into the dreadnought's depleted uranium superstructure. Hull temperatures critical. Armor breach imminent on decks 1 and 2. Henry's hands were steady on the yokes. He didn't alter his trajectory. He drove the ship straight down the throat of the plasma fire. They unleashed a torrent of archaic, brutal physics. Missile pods on the flanks of the human destroyers blew their covers. Hundreds of heavy-yield nuclear torpedoes stir across the dark, leaving trails of burning propellant. The Drevoint defense systems designed to melt incoming plasma or energy bolts struggled to track the solid physical mass of the missiles. When the torpedoes hit the Drev shields, they didn't try to pierce them. They simply detonated. The void flashed with a dozen blinding artificial suns. The sheer concussive force of the nuclear detonations, combined with the extreme electromagnetic pulses, battered the golden energy shields. The Drev phalanx buckled. Ships were shoved out of formation by the shock waves. Their overlapping shield grids flickered, overloaded by the raw thermal output. Good, Henry whispered, wiping a fresh streak of blood from his chin. Hit them while they're blind. As the nuclear glare faded, the UED dreadnoughts moved in. They were massive, heavily armored anvils, much like the Gravedigger, but carrying 50 years of updated tech. They fired their spinal mass drivers. Synchronized, devastating kinetic strikes tore through the weakened Drev shields. Henry watched a Drev carrier ship, a sprawling, elegant vessel holding thousands of troops meant to pacify the colony below, take 3 tungsten slugs simultaneously. The kinetic transfer snapped the carrier in half. Its crystalline spires shattered. Thousands of alien bodies along with atmosphere and burning debris vented into the unforgiving vacuum. The Drev returned fire. Violet plasma beams lashed out, striking the UED ships. Henry gritted his teeth, expecting to see the human vessels melt. But the UED hadn't been idle during the years of supposed peace. The politicians had signed treaties, but the military engineers had kept building. The plasma washed over the human ships, boiling away the outer layers of reactive armor, but failing to penetrate the dense composite sublayers beneath. Hold the line overlapping point defense. Do not let them isolate the destroyers, Hayes ordered over the open frequency. It was a meat grinder. The Drev were fighting a war of elegance and superiority. The humans were fighting a bar brawl in the dark. A Drev cruiser broke from the main group, igniting its engines in a desperate bid to flank the human formation. It was moving fast, its plasma cannons charging to strike the softer rear thrusters of a human destroyer. Henry didn't think. He reacted. Computer, reroute the last drop of backup capacitor power to the starboard point defense cannons. Manual targeting. Commander, firing will drain all remaining power. Life support will cease entirely. Core containment will degrade. Do it. Henry snarled. The Gravedigger was a dead ship drifting in the periphery of the battle. The Drev had ignored it, assuming it was a floating corpse. They were wrong. The starboard cannon spun up. Henry grabbed the targeting trackball. His vision was blurring. A dark ring was closing in around the edges of his sight. He couldn't feel his legs. He relied purely on muscle memory, tracking the trajectory of the flanking Drev cruiser. He squeezed the firing stud. A brief, furious stream of tungsten rounds erupted from the Gravedigger's side. It wasn't a barrage. It was a surgical, desperate burst. The rounds caught the Drev cruiser right in its exposed port thruster bank. The crystal and engine shattered. The cruiser spun wildly out of control, careening directly into the path of a UED mass driver slug. The alien ship vanished in a cloud of vaporized metal. Gravedigger, we see that. Hayes' voice came over the comms, a hint of grim respect in his tone. Stand down, Commander. You've done your part. We have the con. Henry let go of the firing stud. His arm dropped like a lead weight. The bridge plunged into near total darkness as the backup capacitors died. Only the faint dying glow of the tactical screen and the emergency red lights remained. The cold was absolute now. It was seeping into his marrow. He slumped back, his broken rib shifting painfully. He was done. He had fired his last bullet. He had held the line. Now he just had to wait for the dark to finish the job. He closed his eyes. He thought of the cabin. He thought of the fire crackling in the hearth. Then the tactical screen shrieked a proximity warning so loud it rattled his skull. Henry opened his eyes. The battle wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The Drev Armada was taking heavy losses, but they were vast and they were learning. They realized that their skirmish tactics and broad formations were useless against the heavily armored, tightly grouped human fleet. They shifted their strategy. The smaller cruisers and destroyers fell back, forming a defensive perimeter. From the center of the slip space rift, something massive emerged. It dwarfed the wee dreadnoughts. It was a command supercarrier, a sprawling angular monolith of alien engineering. It didn't have the delicate glass and light aesthetic of the smaller ships. It was dark, jagged, and heavily shielded. A thick, pulsating barrier of deep purple energy encased its hull. Henry leaned forward, straining his eyes in the gloom of his freezing bridge. The supercarrier moved to the front of the Drev formation. It didn't fire plasma lances. Instead, the massive split prow of the ship began to glow with a terrifying blinding white light. It was charging a localized singularity weapon, a gravity cannon designed to crush matter into dust. All Vanguard ships, evasive maneuvers, break formation, break formation. Hayes barked over the comms, his usual calm cracking. The UED fleet scattered, but dreadnoughts were not built for agility. The white light at the front of the Drev supercarrier reached a crescendo, a beam of distorted space, bending the light of the distant stars around it, lashed out. It struck the UE dreadnought Widowmaker dead center. There was no explosion. The heavy depleted uranium armor didn't melt. It simply collapsed inward. The sheer gravitational force of the weapon crushed the massive dreadnought like an empty soda can. The ship folded in on itself, condensing into a dense, superheated sphere of metal and flesh before winking out of existence in a brief flash of hard radiation. 300 human sailors gone in a heartbeat. Henry's jaw tightened. The blood in his mouth tasted bitter. The supercarrier began to pivot, its prow charging again, tracking the next largest target in the human fleet. Hayes' flagship, the ironclad. The U-destroyers unleashed everything they had. Torpedoes, mass driver slugs, and railgun batteries hammered the supercarrier. The purple energy shield absorbed it all, rippling with the impacts, but holding firm. The Drev command ship was an immovable object, and it was about to dismantle the human fleet, piece by piece. Route all power to the forward deflectors. Prep the mass drivers for a volley at their main emitter. Hayes commanded, desperation bleeding into the channel. We have to break that shield before it cycles. Henry knew they wouldn't. He knew the math. The UED fleet lacked the concentrated mass to shatter a shield of that magnitude before the gravity weapon fired again. They were going to die. The fleet would break, and Harvest for would remain a graveyard soon to be joined by Earth itself. Henry looked down at his own console. The tactical screen was flickering, the power failing. He looked at his vital signs on the medical readout. His heart rate was dropping. His core temperature was critical. He had maybe 5 minutes of consciousness left. The Gravedigger had no guns left. It had no torpedoes. It had no life support. But it had mass. Millions of tons of depleted uranium and tungsten. And it had a heavy water fusion reactor that was currently unstable and lacking core containment. Henry reached out with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else. He flipped the plastic cover off the manual reactor controls. He didn't type in a sequence. He grabbed the heavy analog lever connected directly to the core safeties and ripped it downward, breaking the locking mechanism. Warning, the computer's voice was sluggish, distorting as the power fluctuated. Reactor core safeties disabled. Coolant pumps offline. Core temperature rising exponentially. Meltdown imminent in 4 minutes. Good, Henry whispered. He engaged the manual thruster controls. He had a few thousand gallons of maneuvering fuel left in the auxiliary tanks. Not enough to fight, but enough to push. He keyed the comms, forcing the signal through the emergency battery. Admiral Hayes, this is Boon, static hissed back, followed by Hayes's strained voice. Boon, we are a little busy dying here. Eject if you have a pod. The line is breaking. The line holds, Henry rasped, his voice echoing in the dead silence of his bridge. Tell your fleet to cease fire on the supercarrier. You're just feeding its shield. If we stop firing, it will vaporize my flagship in exactly 80 seconds, Commander. Give me 60, Henry said. He didn't wait for a response. He slammed his fist down on the thruster ignition. The Gravedigger groaned. The metal of the ship protested, aching with the strain of millions of tons of dead weight being pushed forward by auxiliary engines. The massive dreadnought broke its drift, lumbering out of the periphery of the battlefield, angling directly toward the Dre supercarrier. Boon, what the hell are you doing? Your ship is dead. You have no weapons. Hayes shouted over the channel. I have a ship. Henry said simply. That's a 10-million-ton bullet. Hayes, clear your firing lane. Silence hung on the comms for a long, heavy second. Admiral Hayes understood. He understood the brutal, archaic math of the frontier. Vanguard fleet. Hayes ordered, his voice suddenly quiet, stripped of panic. Cease fire on the primary target. Clear Sector 7. Panic. Cease fire on the primary target. Clear Sector 7. Make way for the Gravedigger. The human fleet parted. The blocky battered destroyers and dreadnoughts ceased their barrage and banked away, creating a wide empty corridor in the void. At the end of that corridor was the Drev supercarrier, its massive prow glowing with the charging light of the gravity weapon, and drifting down that corridor, accelerating slowly but steadily, was the black ruined jagged wedge of the USS Gravedigger. Warning, core temperature critical, meltdown in 90 seconds. The computer chimed. Henry slumped heavily into his restraints. He didn't touch the controls anymore. The course was set. The physics were locked. The Gravedigger was no longer a vessel. It was an unguided kinetic missile carrying an unstable atomic sun in its belly. The Drev commanders on the supercarrier realized the threat too late. They had ignored the dead human ship. Now it was hurtling toward them, a massive unyielding wall of solid iron and uranium. They couldn't pivot the gravity weapon in time. They panicked. The supercarrier's secondary batteries opened up, pouring violet plasma over the Gravedigger. Henry watched the plasma wash over his view screen through half-closed eyes. The armor was melting. The ship was falling apart around him. Bulkheads were collapsing. The temperature on the bridge spiked from freezing to boiling in seconds. He didn't feel it. He felt the mountain. He closed his eyes. He saw the snow falling through the pines. He saw the steam rising from the coffee cup on his porch railing. He heard the distant, lonely howl of Barnaby echoing down the valley. He had lived a quiet life. He had tried to be a quiet man, but the universe didn't want quiet. It wanted blood. He gave it everything he had left. See you soon, old man, Henry whispered into the roaring heat. The collision was a catastrophic event that defied the scale of standard naval warfare. The Gravedigger struck the Drev supercarrier precisely at the center of its split prow, right between the mandibles of the charging gravity weapon. The supercarrier's purple energy shield, designed to deflect energy, weapons and repel high-velocity kinetic slugs, was completely overwhelmed by the sheer grinding mass of a 10-million-ton dreadnought moving at ramming speed. The shield flared into a blinding violet aurora before shattering like brittle glass. The blunt blackened nose of the Gravedigger drove deep into the elegant crystalline architecture of the alien command ship. It crushed bulkheads, collapsed hangar bays, and pulverized the intricate plasma conduits that powered the enemy vessel. The kinetic transfer alone was enough to break the supercarrier's spine. But the Gravedigger wasn't done. Deep inside the crushed bowels of the human dreadnought, the heavy water fusion reactor lost its final layer of magnetic containment to the Vanguard fleet, watching from a safe distance. It looked as though a new star had been born in the shadow of Harvest 4. The reactor detonated. It wasn't a standard explosive blast. It was a raw, localized supernova of atomic fury. The explosion instantly vaporized the Gravedigger, erasing its armored hull, its dead cannons, and the man sitting in the command chair. The atomic fire expanded outward, completely consuming the Drove supercarrier from the inside out. The massive alien command ship didn't just explode, it was unmade. Its armor turned to vapor, its crew turned to ash. The resulting shockwave of radiation and displaced particulate matter violently shoved the surrounding Drev cruisers backward, tumbling them out of control. The blinding flash faded, leaving a massive expanding cloud of glowing radioactive dust where the two behemoths had just been. Absolute silence reclaimed the void. Aboard the ironclad, Admiral Hayes stood on his bridge, staring at the main optical feed. The harsh glare of the atomic blast had cast long, dark shadows across his face. He didn't speak. The bridge crew didn't speak. They watched the glowing dust settle into the orbit of the dead planet below. The Dream Armada, or what was left of it, broke. Without their command ship, without their flagship, and having witnessed the sheer suicidal brutality of the human response, the alien collective lost its nerve. They were conquerors, not martyrs. They didn't understand an enemy that would turn its own ship into AP just to deny them victory. The remaining Dreve cruisers and destroyers spun their drives, tearing open hasty, uncoordinated slip space ruptures. One by one, they fled, disappearing into the dark, leaving their dead behind. Target locks lost. Enemy vessels are retreating, the tactical officer reported. His voice hushed. Reverend? Hayes let out a long, slow breath. He walked over to the primary communications console. He looked at the frequency the Gravedigger had used. It was dead. Only the ambient hiss of cosmic microwave background radiation remained. Stand down from battle stations, Hayes ordered quietly. Deploy rescue shuttles to look for life pods among our fleet and log a victory for the Vanguard. He paused, looking back at the swirling cloud of glowing dust, and logged the loss of the USS Gravedigger. Commander Henry Boon, commanding. He held the line. Down on the surface of Harvest 4, the sky was no longer bruised purple and burning gray. The alien ships were gone. The terrifying pillars of plasma had ceased. The atmosphere was choked with dust, but the clouds were beginning to part, letting the harsh, cold light of a distant sun shine down on the ruined world. Up on the mountain ridge, the snow continued to fall. It fell over the splintered pine trees. It fell over the massive jagged crater where the barn used to be. It fell over the scattered pile of oak rounds and the heavy iron splitting maul resting against a stump. Under the porch of the small solitary cabin, an old hound named Barnaby crept out from the shadows. The dog shook the snow from his coat. He walked to the edge of the ridge, his paws sinking deep into the fresh powder and the layer of gray ash beneath it. He looked down into the valley. New Roanoke was a massive cooling sea of black glass. There were no sounds of children playing. There was no smoke rising from chimneys. It was a tomb. Barnaby sat back on his haunches. He looked up at the sky. He didn't know about the battle in the dark. He didn't know about fleets or reactors or treaties. He only knew that the heavy boots that used to walk the porch were gone. He only knew that the smell of coffee and tobacco was fading into the wind. The hound pointed his nose toward the pale cold sky. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and let out a long, mournful howl. The sound carried down the ridge, echoing over the glass valley, rolling through the silent pines. It was a lonely sound, a sound of grief, but it was also a sound of survival. The mountain man was gone. The dreadnought was ash, but the dirt remained. The blood had been spilled, the chore had been finished, and the earth was quiet once more. High above, hidden among the debris of the orbital graveyard, an automated emergency beacon detached from the last remaining piece of the Gravedigger's aft plating. It powered up running on a small solar trickle charge and began broadcasting a simple repeating message on an encrypted human frequency. It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't a tactical report. It was an automated voice log recorded 20 years ago, triggered by the destruction of the ship. This is Henry Boon. If you're hearing this, the ship is gone. Don't build a monument. Don't sign another treaty. Just remember what lies in the dark and keep your powder dry. The beacon broadcast the message out into the infinite black, a ghost whispering a warning to a galaxy that had finally learned to listen. If this story of ultimate human sacrifice and brutal frontier justice hit you right in the chest, do us a favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you the grittiest, most intense HFY sci-fi stories every single week, and your support helps us keep the forge burning. Let us know in the comments how you felt about Henry's final stand, and share this video with anyone who loves a true underdog story. Humanity never surrenders. Ring the bell. Stay vigilant. Never surrenders. Ring the bell. Stay vigilant.